Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our final guest to address this assembly. Rohinton Medhora is the former chair of the Ontario Workforce Recovery Advisory Committee, which you may know was convened during the pandemic with a mandate to improve employment policy and investment in workers to guide Ontario's economic recovery. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, a think tank in Waterloo. Rohinton, good morning. Thank you so much for coming to speak to the Ontario Assembly on workplace democracy. We're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I guess that's my cue, and I should say good morning to everyone. And it's very good to be with you. I can't think of a better way of spending a fall Saturday morning than discussing labor markets, right? And it shows our sort of commitment to the issue and to our province that we're doing so. Look, I'm not going to take a lot of your time. I thought I'd make 4 points based on some of the things that I came across when I headed the provincial panel that Richard alluded to, and also based on work that my colleagues and I have been doing on this for some time at CG, which I used to head for a number of years. You're at the end of your deliberation, so this is now crunch time where everything you've thought and heard has to come together into something coherent. And I've been there. I'm sure all of you have as well. And what follows are just some reflections from me. Not even worth 2 cents probably, but bear me out for a few minutes. I guess the first point I'd make about workplace democracy is the highly changed and changing environment within which it operates. I recall when my panel, ORAC, was struck, which was last summer, some of us had already been talking about how technology and other forces were changing the way the workplace looks and feels and operates. And then along came COVID. And so COVID didn't change the fundamentals. All it did was added octane to things we were already talking about. Working from home, the role of algorithms, declining industrialization. And the point I'm trying to make is that no one really knows what the future looks like. Usually in panels like ours, it helps to have a vision and then to work back from the vision and say, this is our vision, and therefore these are the things we think we should be doing to reach it. And my sense in this field is that technology and other forces are so dynamic, many of them so unknowable, that it's difficult to have a single vision, or if there is, it's going to be fuzzy. And that's okay. And that's my main point. Unlike, say, and I just give this to you as an example, if you're thinking about monetary policy, you kind of begin by saying, we want an inflation rate environment that's around 2%. And you kind of work backwards from that and things fall into place. In the case of worker voice and labor markets more generally, it's not clear to me if we can articulate something that clean and neat as the endpoint because of all of these other factors that are constantly happening. And so the vision is going to be fuzzy. And so my advice is that's okay. And what that means for your work is that perhaps your recommendations should be flexible, that they can adapt to different environments. Another way to put that is to say they should be resilient to different scenarios. In fact, the word scenarios reminds me that perhaps in exercises like yours, sometimes it helps to work towards different scenarios and outline 2 or 3 visions of the future and say, depending on which one holds, this is what we might think. And so we have to recognize that we live in a highly imperfect and unknowable world. And if anyone tells you otherwise, be suspicious of that too. Final point on vision and how to get there. No change is neutral, okay? Everything you recommend will have a change. Even if it maintains the status quo, that, in my view, is a non-neutral change. Opting for the status quo is also a positive statement that opts for something. And so think about what the consequences would be of your various thoughts. And that might get you towards building a vision in some ways. Second point, when we began this work and we spoke to something like 760 individuals and groups in the space of 3 or 4 months on our panel. I know that your assembly is nonpartisan. That's exactly as it should be. So is our panel. What struck me as someone who has not been partisan, I've just been a professional economist all my life, is how apolitical a lot of the things we were discussing and probably you're discussing are. I don't think the current trends in labor markets map neatly onto whether you're on the left or the right or the center, or whether you believe that free markets are best or government intervention is best or any of that. I think there's room for hybrid solutions in everything. And you will find that sometimes free markets work best if they're guided in some ethical or legislative framework. Governments work best when they are, in some senses, disciplined by markets. And it's very complicated to think in terms of politics. And I found it refreshing that we could talk about technology and labor markets and COVID and so on without that lens. And I think you have that freedom, and that's great. A second way to look at that is to say, governments can't do everything. I know Lisa Raitt made that point to you when you began, but think about also all the things that cannot happen if government did not act. And so there's some role for government, but there's also role for firms, for civic society, and for us as individuals to make a difference. And so recommendations don't have to be targeted at any one part of society. They have to be for every group, and we're all in it together. My third point is a classic Canadian point, and I know you've probably come across it, which is we live in a federation. There are overlapping jurisdictions, and don't fuss too much, even though I know that your recommendations go to the Minister of Labour in Ontario. Don't fuss too much about how much of that is federal, how much of that is municipalities, and so on. It's okay. Most of the big issues of our time in this country overlap across jurisdictions. And when we did the kinds of recommendations we did on ORAC, many of our recommendations were made knowing fully that they were not in the purview, all of them, of the Minister of Labour. But Ontario is the biggest economically speaking province in the country. We are a G7 country. What Ontario does matters nationally and internationally. And so think of the demonstration effect that your work has, even if it's targeted within a province in a relatively small country. And my final point has to do with something else we grappled with, and I'm sure you will as well, which is feasibility. We spent a lot of time thinking, that may be a good idea, but will it happen? Will the minister like it? Will the officials like it? That's important. I mean, there's no point presenting ideas that are totally outlandish. On the other hand, if all you limit yourself to are ideas that someone's going to pick up tomorrow, you've probably missed the ball. My favorite example on this is universal childcare. So universal childcare is something that's now broadly accepted. It is national policy and policy in, I think, every province in the country. There is a strong ethical, legal, equity, economic case to be made for it. It's been made for years and years. We finally got a semblance of universal childcare in this country, starting with the government announcement a year or two ago. Quebec as a province had that previously, but that was it. Now, here's the thing. Do you know when universal childcare was first proposed in Canada as a serious policy prescription? It was the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which was struck in 1967. I'm not saying every good idea should take 50 years to come to fruition, but sometimes good ideas fester and they linger and they don't go away. And so if you think there's something that's ahead of its time, don't hesitate to say it, and don't be discouraged if it doesn't sort of become policy in the next month or year or even 2 or 5 years. Good ideas have a way of staying and growing and blooming. All of that to say that you've got a great set of discussions ahead of you. I know a good morning ahead of you. I will be watching some of it with interest, and I wish you well, and thank you for having me. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Rohinton, for that. I can't imagine a better way to address this assembly on its final day than those words of wisdom and advice and caution. I think we'll take that to heart. Absolutely right. I think to all of us, knowing that no one knows what the future looks like. I think if we did, this assembly wouldn't have had to gather at all. And I think absolutely right. Difficult to have a single vision, but to think in hybrid solutions. And indeed, that's what the Assembly has been doing, looking at opportunities for improving worker voice, what role governments can play, what role regulators can play, what role employers can play, what role unions can play. So you really have spoken to, I think, a lot of the work and helped bring us home in this assembly. So thank you very much for that. We'll be looking for you to continue to follow the work that we do.